Good day, everyone. This is Alan Schimmel, Security Boulevard, and welcome to another webinar. We have a good webinar today. It's the 4 current threats enterprises can't ignore. And it's actually based on an ebook that we've published here at Security Boulevard with the help of some of our sponsors. We hope you'll be able to download the ebook as well. Before we get started, I wanted to just go over a little bit for those of you who may have not attended any of our webinars before. We use the GoToWebinar control panel or the GoToWebinar webinar system. And for most of you, that means you have the GoToWebinar control panel in your top right-hand corner of your screen. It's really easy to use. There's just 2 sections I want to call to your attention today. Number 1 is if you see a section marked questions. If you could hit the little arrow so it's pointing downward. We have set aside time for questions on today's webinar, and our panel is looking forward to answering and hearing your questions and answering them. What we'd like you to do is type your questions in here in real time. You don't have to worry about remembering them for the end. They'll be typed in, they'll be queued and ready to rock and roll. We'll have a record of it. We can get you your answers. And that is the way we interact with the audience for questions for our panelists on the subject matter. So please don't wait till the end to type in your questions, because then you get the rush and there's no guarantee it'll get asked and answered. Type your questions in real time as they pop into your mind. Secondly, I want to direct your attention down to the bottom of the webinar control panel to the section marked chat. And again, if you expand that, here at Security Boulevard and DevOps.com, we use chat more for technical issues. So if for some reason your audio stops working or the slides aren't advancing or something else is wrong, we do have engineers standing by to try to help fix those issues. And if you will click on or type into chat, someone will reach back out to you and try to help you with whatever your issue is. We'll do our best. Next, I know the first question everyone always asks, and someone's already asked it on the question section, is will there be a recording and will the slides be available? Yes, this webinar is being recorded. Yes, the slides will be available. You'll be able to get them on Security Boulevard probably within 24 hours of today's show, as well as on our YouTube channel, which is DevOps TV, DEVOPS TV, all one word. And I believe there's a Security Boulevard TV channel too, which you may be able to access it on. So with that being said, let us jump into today's webinar. As I mentioned, the webinar is 4 current threats that enterprises can't ignore. And before I introduce you to our panelists, I wanted to just take a quick moment to thank our sponsors, because none of this gets done without sponsors helping us, and not only with the content, but in making it possible for us to do this webinar today. So I'd like to thank CA Vericode, White Hat Security, One Login, and Rapid7. 4 of the leading names in the security world for sponsoring today's webinar. And with that, let me introduce our panelists from their respective sponsors. Number 1, up on the top left of your screen, we have Brandon Cretin, Research Architect at Vericode. Brandon, welcome.
Hi, thank you, Alan.
Thanks for being here. Just wanted to make sure your sound was working. The lady in the middle needs no introduction to those of you who've listened in on Security Boulevard webinar. She's a frequent guest and always has some great contributions. I love having her on here. Jeannie Warner, Security Manager, White Hat Security. Hi, Jeannie. How are you?
Hey, Alan. Thanks. That's very kind of you.
Okay. And then a newcomer to our webinar family, making his first appearance today, Ben Sherman, Solutions Engineer at One Login. Ben, welcome.
Sweet. Pleased to be here. Thanks, Alan.
Thanks to have you here. And then last but certainly not least, from Rapid7, a company I go back to Rapid7 from, I think, the first day they started. Scott King, Senior Director, Rapid7 Consulting. Scott, welcome.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
Pleasure to have you here. Okay, so guys, let's dig into it. As I mentioned before, today's webinar is really based on an ebook that, with the help of our sponsors, we've had one of the leading writers in security, Jay Vijayan, who's written for Computer World and Info World and all of the IDGs, as well as probably every other security e-zine or publication that you've ever read. Jay's been around a while. He took this assignment of the 4 current threats enterprises can't ignore, and everyone listening can download this book from Security Boulevard at the link in here. We'll pass that out via our GoToWebinar control panel as well. And I do strongly encourage you. I think it's only about 9 or 10 pages. Strongly encourage everyone to take a look at the book and add it to your digital library. So the idea here, though, is, new threats demand new responses, right? I've been in the security world for 20 years. I know many of you on our panel have been on as long as or maybe you don't want to admit that you're that old, but you've been around enough to know. But what's interesting is when we look at these 4 threats, 2 or 3 of them are somewhat new, but certainly at least one of them, if not more, have been around for some time. And it's kind of painful to say we haven't been able to crack this nut. We haven't been able to figure it out. And it demands, I guess, an explanation, and we'll try to dive into these things. But for now, let's dive into our 4 different threats that demand your attention. Okay, so the first one we're going to talk about is ransomware. And hopefully no one in our audience listening today has been a victim yet of ransomware, but 26% of all ransom attacks last year were directed at businesses, up marginally from the year before. But a business is hit with ransomware every 40 seconds. And the average ransomware demand is now more than $1,000, but not much more for the most part. I mean, there are ones that are significantly more, but not much more than $1,000. And it's become so prevalent that really it's become a question of not if, but when. So let me throw this out at our audience, our panel, excuse me. Initial thoughts on ransomware. Jeannie, why don't we let you go first?
Sure thing. Wow, I don't think ransomware is going anywhere soon, especially since they found some different ways to weaponize it. For instance, if you look at WannaCry as the big one, the WannaCry heard around the world that, hypothetically, they're saying it came out of Korea. Then you have the Petya, and not Petya, which came out of Russia. Ransomware is always designed to do something in particular. NotPetya actually took away and said we were going to attack some different banking systems within Ukraine, kind of shut them down. I think what ransomware is showing is how complex things are going to get, because it's not just an end user anymore, and it's not just, oh, somebody's going to click a link that they shouldn't have. It's not your secretary's fault. And I think that's important, because looking at how they go and how they're built, they're getting a lot more complicated and combining many different types of tool and attacks. And there's always a reason. Like I was looking at law firms and the Panama Papers and the Appleby attack, and they're going after things for a reason. So I think ransomware is going to stay and keep being used as long as there's still insecure data hygiene in the world.
Agreed. Guys, go ahead.
Yeah, I think yeah, those are all good points. I mean, one interesting thing that kind of adds complexity is you mentioned some of the nation state inspired or suborned attacks there. And it's interesting because in a lot of those cases, it's believed that the motives behind those aren't actually just to make money. That was actually that the infrastructure was set up such that they couldn't really receive payments in many cases or unlock or so yeah, it is interesting to see that this being used as not only a tool for organized criminals, but as a cover for other more directed activity. One of the interesting things that I've seen relatively recently in the past couple of years, and this has made headlines as well occasionally, is attacks against specific data stores like databases and cloud services. And now there's cottage industry of sorts of researchers looking for open S3 buckets and finding incredible amounts of interesting and scary data out there. So and even in cases where it's not writable, I would say having a good asset inventory of all of your data repositories, whether they be on premises, in the cloud, and whatnot, is kind of going to be essential to preventing this kind of thing.
Agreed. Anyone else?
Hygiene was brought up, and if you think about it, one of the problems with ransomware is that poor hygiene. And as ransomware may actually be driving more folks to the cloud, but the problem with how ransomware might get in the first place into an enterprise organization is perhaps through stolen credentials. And why do credentials get stolen? Maybe poor password hygiene. So perhaps to cure that problem, we may see fewer credentials as vectors as one solution. One note, the mean time of that disease vector, organizations can have breaches that last for months, and some of the newer cloud-based modern technologies could kind of execute sessions in terms of minutes and knock off some of those potential vectors. So hopefully we can kind of turn this with different types of security postures that are win-win. Maybe even reducing help desk calls with password resets and things of that nature to reduce also the ransomware vectors, just as a thought.
We could hope.
Yeah, and I guess.
Go ahead.
Oh, sorry, Alan. I was just going to kind of add to the discussion a little bit. What we do as an industry and as a profession is really about managing risk. And it's about reducing that risk as much as we can through a variety of different technical capacities and controls. And when we're talking specifically about ransomware, there's a variety of ways that ransomware can obviously infiltrate computing systems. And there's a variety of paths that both users, IT administrators, and security professionals can take to help reduce the risk of that ransomware making its way into the environment. Everything from having up-to-date filtering going on within your email content gateways to blocking those types of communications through web browsing activity, as well as doing simple things like removing administrative rights from user-level accounts on endpoints. In addition to kind of putting in place some technologies on the endpoints, and I'm not going to name any companies here, obviously, because we don't want to endorse anything, but there's a lot of technologies out there which are able to essentially protect the kernel and better protect the operating system from attacks like this. And lastly, I'd say our overall last line of defense is the detection capability. So monitoring things like file stores, monitoring things like assets for early indications and early warnings of ransomware style attacks can help give the defenders inside of an organization visibility into what's happening so they can have a chance of recovering from it quickly.
Yep. Excellent point. All of you have some excellent points here. And what we're really talking about is sort of active defense solutions on how to prevent this ransomware from succeeding, right? And encrypting and making you hostage to it. One of the lessons I was hammered into my head in security over the last 10 years was the idea that we can't put all our eggs in the prevention bucket, and we need to have a response, plan in place where if, the worst happens, what do you do? And what's interesting is I've recently started to see when I look at security conferences and marketing materials, companies starting to say, hey, by keeping your data with us, whether it be a DR solution, offsite backup, what have you, but when you get hit with ransomware, your data is still safe with us. And, it sounds pragmatic, right? Don't worry, don't put all your eggs in the active defense and prevention. Have a good response plan in place. And overall, that's not a bad security strategy, right? To have response plans in place. But is this the place for that? Should everyone have a response plan in place, or, something like an offsite, untouchable, they're not directly connected data store that will not be affected by a ransomware kind of attack? What do you guys think?
It's funny. We tend to encrypt a lot of the data internally and then send it off-site encrypted. The cloud allows more encryption, but we're really, if what you're saying is more off-site storage and tape media, think about how much higher our storage densities have gotten, but also how much more data there is that folks want to store encrypted off-site. I wonder if we can actually keep up with that. Would there be a line of trucks from every large corporate environment just pulling disks at this point? The whole point of kind of distributing to the cloud was to try to reduce some of that on-site
some
labor.
of the Iron Mountain kind of, yeah. I agree. Anyone else?
I'm with him in wondering if we're going to see a rise of something called the Iron Cloud. I wonder if Iron Mountain's going to branch out and say, hey, you can only, time-based, area-based. I think it's interesting, but there's just too many ways in, I think, honestly. Some of the ransomware is now setting its own SOX proxy internally, so it conceals communications, and there's tools for it. So I don't know that any of that is ever going to prevent, detection is why it ever going to be as good as prevention in the first place. Ransomware has even moved into mobile at this point with encrypting, resetting, and the combination of ransomware and blackmailware. And what are you going to do if they insert things and the FBI shows up on your door saying, hey, we've been informed reliably that you have this on your servers, which still, even if it's not true, removes them from your control for a certain amount of time. So there's so many different ways that these old tools are being reharvested and reused. So I like the idea of backup, but I don't think it's feasible in a lot of cases. Consider the hospital. How long is it going to take them to get hospital things back up online and retrieved from storage, installed from storage, and you have live patients? So that's my concern and my hesitation before I embrace anything about backup.
Agreed. I think that's a valid point. Any other opinions on this one?
Yeah, I think it's something that should be definitely emphasized. I mean, it's one of the reasons we've obviously chosen to have this as one of the 4 greater threats, but it's definitely something that should be kind of top of mind when doing any type of DR or business continuity or risk assessment with the broader folks at the organizations you work with, because as you just mentioned, I agree. I don't think it's going away, and there are a lot of different ways that this can manifest. So I think the best thing you can do at a broader level, not just a technical one, is to be prepared for as many of these contingencies and have plans so that you aren't caught off guard when any of those scenarios, which 5 years ago may have seemed a little unlikely, but now, I can see all of them happening today.
Sure. It sounds like something out of Mr. Robot, right? Iron Cloud and all of these things, but yet it's real. Got an interesting question from Vincent in the audience, and it's he's interested in hearing about the use of ransomware from the perspective of criminal enterprise operations of financing. For example, the ransomware people, they seem to price the ransoms, just under the anticipated remediation case cost to make it a business financial decision. And that's the third bullet on our slide here. Should we just pay the ransom? Right? Because at the end of the day, it is a business decision. Having the trucks constantly pulling up and going to Iron Cloud and Iron Mountain, there's a cost involved in that. And if these ransomware guys, and make no mistake, they're not dummies. If they're able to price it at below the cost where it's cheaper to just pay it and move on, I mean, it's good. What's a good businessman to do? Scott, what about you? Or
I'm kind of torn on that particular issue, right? I mean, obviously having response plans in place are super important. Making sure that you're communicating with internal communication teams, having crisis communication plans in place, exercising those plans through a variety of different scenarios and injects. But I think at the end of the day, getting to the question of do you pay the ransom, which is I think what you're alluding to, I'm kind of torn on that issue, right? I mean, as a nation, we have this policy of don't pay terrorists, right? Don't succumb to terrorist demands.
Yeah.
And, provided that there's always going to be money to be made around ransomware attacks, I don't see them stopping, right? And we as a technology industry, we're probably not ever going to be in a place where we can totally prevent these things universally across the board. So what I think we have to do is take a systematic approach at hardening different types of assets that are important to us and making sure that the data associated with those assets is well protected beyond the means that you would for a normal average user. So perhaps we can dig into that as we continue through this webcast into the other areas as well, because I think that theme kind of cross cuts through many of these issues and many of these challenges that we're going to talk about today.
Yeah, I agreed. Before we move on, I mean, look, as a security, so yes, you don't negotiate with terrorists. That's a given. But even beyond that, as a security professional, it just galls the heck out of me to just pay the money, even though it may in fact be the smarter business decision, and I consider myself a businessman. It galls me to pay these people to give me back my data. It's my data. I don't know.
Me every time I pay $2.99 to pull my money out of the bank, but I do it.
You're right. You know what? And yes, so that's something I've discovered in traveling around the world. In a lot of other countries, cash machines are free, but that's a different webinar, Jeannie. But it does gall me, right? And I think it probably does for a lot of our people listening in. What do you guys? I mean, is it the smart business thing to just pay it and move on?
So Alan, one of the worries there, and I think this has been written about quite a bit, is that when folks take the little bite and maybe they pay, even though everybody's disappointed that they do, the next time that same vector is still in their organization, sitting on an SMB share, having new ways of infiltrating that organization. And so they'll upcharge the next time. There's no guarantee that once someone malevolent is on the inside, that you won't just get encrypted again by the ransomware. So at that point, you're pretty much blank slating anyway an organization, and perhaps the cost of doing something like that outweighs the small amount of data that was lost on individual systems that were compromised.
Yeah, you're signaling to somebody with the incentive to damage you and extort you. You're signaling to them that, hey, you have succeeded. You have found something that I am willing to pay for to retrieve it. So, you know, even if you're able to contain the incident, then if you have a sufficiently motivated attacker, and of course they're motivated now, um, they know where to look and they know what to go after next time. So, you know, there's a combination of that I would think about. Like I from a, you know, I don't have any, I'm sure there are situations where paying a ransom would be the smart business decision. And I wouldn't actually fault anybody for coming to that conclusion. But, you know, a combination of situations like that, where you're saying, hey, this is my crown jewels and you stole them, here's a reward. But also the sense that, you know, at least some of these have been like paying the ransom won't always get your data back. Some of these have been false flags, and some of these have been you know, just taken down by researchers or governments or whoever by the time you actually go to pay. So
I agree with you. I mean, you know, the whole idea of paying the ransom almost institutionalizes the idea of honor among thieves, right? That these people are really going to unencrypt you if you pay your money. And what's to stop them from saying, "Nah, I decided I want twice as much," or "I'm not going to do it," or they just never hear from them again, right? But you know, contrast that with the horror stories we've heard of, you know, ongoing businesses, maybe not large enterprises, but smaller organizations who refused to pay the money at first, but really couldn't do business. I mean, their operations were done. They were locked. And you know, it could do you go out of business because you weren't smart enough to put a plan in place beforehand? Or do you pay the money because you need to stay in business? As a business person, that's a really, really scary proposition. Really scary. And it's something that people have had to face with this. Yeah?
Alan, I think it's going to be a matter of just looking at saying what other businesses like you, how have they been hit? A lot of the ransomware, it's less than $1,000, you know, 0.013 Bitcoins. If somebody hits you with like a NotPetya or a destructive ransomware, there's not a lot you can do. But my point on it is, you know, you've got to do the hygiene, you've got to have your plan. All of these things that we've all been saying are important to think about. But in terms of keeping their up at night, if they kidnap your kid, you pay the ransom. FBI tells you that, everyone tells you that, you just pay the ransom. So having the ability of knowing how in any organization to buy a Bitcoin to say, all right, this is a hiccup. If this happens, we're going to pay this up to this amount, and then we're going to do this. But putting that into your plan is important. It's like, I hate to say it's the cost of doing business, but just being aware of how you need to do it and how you might one day need to buy a Bitcoin is part of a security plan. It's got to be. Anybody who isn't is kind of fooling themselves.
Agreed. Guys, we've not wasted. We've spent a lot of time talking about this, and I think it's warranted. To everyone listening out there, you need to be thinking about this. But let us move on. Before we do, I wanted to just mention that in the chat window, Ben on our engineering team has posted the link to the Security Boulevard page with the download for the ebook. So you can get that there. Let's move on to our next topic, though, and that's IoT threats. So, guys, I think I told you all off mic before we started, I looked at it originally and said, oh, no, not the old IoT threat again. But yet, you know, I was at DevOps Enterprise Summit in London about 2 weeks ago, and there was a fellow named Chris Hill from Jaguar. And you know, he gave me a stat that the average car today has hundreds of millions of lines of code embedded in them. The amount of sensors they have and their connectivity and everything else, and they're updated, right? They're updated and not just Tesla. This would happen to be Jaguar, but all of these cars today, they basically get updated remotely, a lot of them. And they, so there's so much in our cars. I just had our house redone and my refrigerator has an IP address now. It's real. It's no longer the stuff of science fiction or roll your eyes. IoT threats. Thoughts? Let's see, we've had Scott go first, Jeannie go first. Ben, how about you want to go first on this one?
Yeah, sure. I think about it, I think it was last year that we exceeded 7 billion machines having identities from the IoT. So the tipping point, more machines than people on the planet. Mm-hmm. And one of the thoughts that I've had is, if we were to treat those same devices, not because we have an existential threat right now, but if devices have an identity, maybe we could apply role-based access control, provisioning and deprovisioning to the very basis of having all of these things out there. Because like identities, if you distribute an IoT type device, you're guaranteed to lose track of it over time. And one of the things we learned in the identity as a service space was that, ironically, and we saw this with cell phones in particular, that you can actually find them when they phone in, and it's a really great way to inventory them once they get lost, not only because they're accessing corporate applications and whatnot, but quite accidentally, Identity as a Service actually was able to find all of these devices that these companies could not find that were compliance issues. So, in a way, there are possibilities for introducing good core hygiene for these IoT devices. And machine learning and some other anomaly type detection methods actually will get us into a spot where we don't all have to hail our future IoT overlords now that we're second to the machines, but rather bring in some considered thinking in terms of how you manage the devices once they're rolled out in an infrastructure. And I think role-based access control might be one of them to try to get a handle on it so that they don't become more of a problem in the future.
Yep.
And I think, kind of adding to that, there's a couple of helpful ways to think about this, right? There's IoT or quote unquote IoT devices that are in common use within commercial enterprises, such as industrial IoT, but there's also a lot of IoT that's in use in the consumer space, right? Through smart homes and smart home systems and things like that. And I think there's different risk profiles based on those two applications. And then there's a third application, which is IoT as it's being coined in the medical device community. So, I think organizations and companies and manufacturers of these types of technologies, they really need to play into the fact that some of these present more societal risk than others. So, for example, consumer-based products, there's a potential risk of a consumer using those and their home being broken into, but that risk is going to be there whether they're using IoT or not. In fact, I'd argue the attack surface is probably a bit more advanced with IoT as opposed to someone just breaking a window and breaking into your home. But for things like medical device security, as well as commercial or industrial Internet of Things, those require a level of diligence in the manufacturing development process that we're just not seeing today on a widespread basis. I mean, we're seeing new vulnerabilities pop up. We're seeing, a significant number of systems that are being depicted on Shodan. And it's just, we're just not seeing the type of attention that this problem actually deserves. And I'm not quite sure how to change that without talking about more regulation, unfortunately, around device manufacturers.
No,
I think.
Okay. No, go ahead.
Yeah, I have to agree there. It really is a good point because a lot of the attention here does go to the, we have all of these people plugging in these devices into their home network. But yeah, I believe the true threat are the true threats we're talking about are the embedded systems that are not really being addressed by that group. You mentioned Alan. You mentioned Jaguar earlier. We're entering a world where cars are not only running off of code, because that's been true for a long time, but they're also now increasingly communicating with the outside world. It's not finalized yet, but there's a V2V, so vehicle to vehicle communications regulation that was close to being adopted by the Department of Transportation here in the U.S., but isn't quite, it hasn't been done yet. So, and even though that's not going to be mandated by regulations, this is something that manufacturers are actively pursuing, and the regulatory framework surrounding it isn't really taking security into account as much as I believe it should. So, add that to the list, I guess I would say. We have cars that are going to be talking to each other everywhere soon.
One of the examples that was in the news recently back in April, but a problem that had existed for quite some time, the casino in North America that was infiltrated, and the vector for getting the data out, since there was no other way out to get the high roller database out, was actually an aquarium fish tank temperature sensor. So definitely an IoT device, something in the lobby. And the idea here that that is an attack surface, and for things like data exfiltration, and that it had an ability to phone home, I think is of concern. And I hadn't thought of it really as a serious concern, really until that story came out and customers started talking about it at the corporate scale a lot more.
I believe so, and I really think we're just entering the true age of IoT security issues, right? Right now we see it maybe in DDoS attacks, which we're going to talk about in a moment. But I remember, and this is going back to maybe 2005. Company I had founded, we had the U.S. Geological Survey was one of our customers, and these people have seismic sensors on the bottom of the ocean to sense earthquakes and stuff in the ocean floor. And the issue is they didn't want security on those devices, right? They had because they felt they were scientists and they didn't need, or they shouldn't have security. The information should be open to everyone. And I think there's still a lot of that out there. Not that they're not everyone is scientists, but people don't understand that anything that's connected could potentially be a security issue. And until that becomes clear to people, I don't know if we truly are ready to deal with the problem.
I think you're right on that, Ben. I think it's got to be called safety, not security. Everybody's used to cybersecurity and they think IT, but they do safety testing. They do ECC testing. They do interface testing. They take a little plastic child's finger-sized thing and poke at every object. I think absolutely we need to start having the interfaces that say this is a safety test. It's not even just security. It's got to be safety, because I don't want your Apple Watch to drive my car off the road in a complicated murder plot.
Yep. All right, guys, we're going to need to move on here. I'm sorry. This is a good conversation, but moving right along, though. Let's move into our third area, and that's DDoS attacks, right? And as it says here on the right side panel, it's amazing to me that DDoS attacks are still as big or bigger even than they were even 5, 7, 8 years ago, right? I thought with the advent of the cloud and burstability and not infinite, but much larger capacities, we see the end of DDoS. But certainly we haven't. In fact, the DDoSes have just gotten bigger. It's the old saying. I remember when I used to say, why would anyone need more than a 10 megabit hard drive? And, look at our hard drives today. As our capacity to repel them has grown, so has their capacity to do it. What's to do, right? And many of you work for companies that, might have DDoS type of defenses. As security people, we're all well aware, of what are some of the high watermarks in terms of what's the maximum load that some of these DDoS attacks have carried through. What can we do? Why is this still a problem in 2018, 2019? So I think we haven't started with Brandon yet. So how about you, Brandon? Would you like to kick this one off?
Sure. Yeah, I'll talk about it a little bit. I with you. I mean, we've seen it kind of for as long as there's been any kind of widespread tracking of security issues. It's been always at the front of it. I don't think DDoS or kind of denial of service in general is going away. I mean, you mentioned increased capacities as a factor. So and sure, we have really fast connections for services, and we've got and servers, and we can scale in very interesting ways now. But at the same time, the capacities of individual endpoints are increasing as well. And now that DDoS is the primary vector, you have an arbitrary selection of devices out there. A lot of them are going to be on pretty fast links. An interesting kind of, when I recommend things to people, I wouldn't dissuade people from going after from pursuing a commercial mitigator approach, like the Akamai's and the Cloudflares and what have you. But I think before you get to that point, it's worth doing an assessment of a risk assessment of the application inventory and figuring out what it is you want to protect. And then once you get to the point of pursuing technical approaches, that's just one part of it. I think another part is actually working with your engineering teams and your developers and kind of modeling this and testing for it and figuring out where those bottlenecks might be. One interesting thing that I've seen is that, yes, we're in a world where now applications are kind of often piece by piece, microservice by microservice in some cases, moving to the cloud. So, you visit a website, you're talking to many different services. As that's kind of happened relatively quickly over the years, bottlenecks might occur in strange places. And so if you're a developer who's been working on the same team for 3 or 4 years, where you think the bottlenecks are, you might be wrong about that. You might see some interesting things pop up. So those are kind of my thoughts on it.
Fair enough. Anyone else? Some thoughts on DDoS?
I mean, this is one of those.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of those. No, it's all right, man. This is one of those challenges that I think has a variety of different solution paths, and I mean, it's just a simple matter of capacity demands versus capacity constraints, and it's kind of unrealistic to think that any company out there implementing a internet presence of some sort through their data centers is going to have the ability to handle and mitigate DDoS by themselves. It has to happen upstream from them. And I would also say that from a strategic perspective, if DDoS is a risk factor to a business, and I fully agree that it's one of those things that needs to be assessed, perhaps the best strategy is to outsource the hosting of their portals, their websites, their customer information systems to cloud providers, which have much more bandwidth, much more capacity, and actually the service comes with an offering to have DDoS prevention as part of it. I just think that this is one of those challenges that individual companies aren't going to be successful at navigating, and the remediation and mitigation approach has to happen further upstream on the internet from them. That's really the only, or that's kind of the best approach that they can take when it comes to worrying about this and doing something about it.
I have to agree with that. I went out and asked some of our different WAF and RAS partners, saying, what are you doing? How are you preparing for the new deluge? What's going on? On the one hand, they're like, there's a couple that said, yes, boy, they really wish ISPs did have more of a choke and did have more actual services they could offer that way. But they said, in general, the thing was, look at if you're going to go for a WAF or a next-gen firewall or some combination, it very much is about capacity needs. I mean, you're looking at your POP architecture versus some kind of content delivery network. Should they be the same? How many terabytes do they have? And there's a bunch of questions that maybe we all need to put out as security professionals and say, ask these. When you're doing an evaluation of your individual solution, one, what is the likelihood of you getting DDoSed? Well, if you're a gaming company, nearly 1,000%. If you're a small mom and pop selling Coke bottles out of your house, probably very small. So what is your threat versus how much you're spending? And then look at the capacity. How many terabytes per second, can you get up and running? And are they delivered? Are they global? Can they protect you from DDoSes coming and originating in many different places through many different servers? And who knows, maybe we need to go back to ICANN and say, do we need to contain this at the domain level? What an interesting question.
All of that presumes that it's an external vector and that folks have been secure with their reverse proxies as the defense. But I was surprised as a network-based person looking at a lot of packets internally to the network that SYN flood events, which are really DDoS, are more often actually emanating from inside large corporate networks. And yet most of the packet level monitoring systems have really focused more toward applications. So the ports and IP addresses are the way that you designate what an application is. And they were missing the very fact that they were being DDoSed from the inside to take down their corporate network by added pressure. So the result or the symptom is everything's slow, but why? But they couldn't pin it to one particular app or one particular IP. It was a pressure on the entire organization, grinding it to a halt. And that's because only the older network monitoring product would see that, because it was originally designed to see flapping NIC cards, as opposed to the more modern network monitoring products, which are really application focused. But because SYN floods can masquerade as any port or IP, they'll miss it. And so that's one of those odd things that if you're always looking for rogue or foreign IP addresses, you may not actually find it if it emanates from the inside as one of those gotchas in either the diversity or failover scenarios that they might consider.
Excellent. Excellent. Just a real quick question from the audience. Aliber asked, do we think DDoS attacks will increase with the IoT, quote unquote boom era? And that's what I was getting at before, is that, with all of these devices being potentially used against us, how can it help but not increase, the scale of our DDoS attacks? They seem intrinsically linked. Thoughts?
It's disturbing to think that maybe state-sponsored attacks could take over those botnets that go after the consumer devices like cameras and actually scale up. I don't think we've actually seen the extent that state-sponsored. Maybe we've seen some testing and teasing with some of the larger capacity attacks, but I wonder what happens when the states really want to wage war. Would that take down the internet as we know it? And that's a concern. I think everybody needs to be concerned about that.
No, it's real. I mean, and again, in the security industry, we tend to Chicken Little stuff, but this isn't Chicken Little, man. This is real. This could happen. So just
yeah, I think even aside from the state-sponsored stuff, which I agree is a real risk. I think we're short term. I think the answer is we're going to see more of these devices until the manufacturers and the engineers behind all of these can take security more seriously. And there's countless examples of people finding small scale botnets. By small scale, I mean only tens of thousands of these devices, and often they're limited to a specific internet service provider or geographical area because that's where the product itself is sold. But because there's so many out there, I think we're going to continue to see these for some time.
Yeah, unfortunately, I think we are. Guys, we only have about 10 minutes left, so I wanted to get to our fourth threat because it's no less important than anything else we're talking about here today, and that's sort of the mobile malware, mobile malevolent. I'm not even going to try to pronounce it. Malvolence is perhaps. Gina, you do a better job on it than I do, but but certainly we live in an age where, again, I just got back from China a week and a half ago. They have like 700 million cell phones there. And, think about, and most of them probably running some version of Android, right? And so think about how destructive a truly kind of viral mobile malware, Android based. Not to say that iPhone's more secure, it's not. But, think about how destructive and far reaching that could be. 700 million devices. Man, that's a big attack surface, right? What do we do? What can we do here?
Well, if you want me to jump into the mobile maleficence out there, we work with a couple different companies and have our own pen testers in there, and we found about 85% in like 2017. We looked about 45,000 mobile apps, and 85% of them violated at least one or more of the OWASP, like mobile top 10. And the top 4, if anybody cares, were like insecure data storage, insecure communications, and encode and implementation issues. Why it matters is very much when they were talking, if we roll back to that extremely long talk we had at the beginning on ransomware and how it got in, let's talk credentials. I mean, a lot of people have their credentials are married in their device management in different, if they have O365, if they access through multiple places. All you need to do is have your phone give a key into the network. Once you're into a network, then there's all the different methodologies for traveling internally, hiding proxies. But I view at this point, mobile is definitely the key in how to get into a network. If I wanted to know how, I just capture their credentials, capture their information, capture content card. I have a beautiful horror story on ransomware and injections on a phone of how individually it can completely screw up your life and lose your job. So I don't know that it is the threat that we're all worried about, that somebody's going to exfiltrate terabytes worth of data through my phone, but my phone is a key. So how am I going to let people into my network? And that's what I think they're not really worried about. And that's where I think we need to look at it a little bit more closely in terms of maybe MDMs and everybody who's producing an app. How does it attack? How is it a vector for any of those other things that we've discussed within the environment?
Fair. Other thoughts, comments?
Even if you don't have an MDM, this may spell some warning about the old VPN approach. If credentials are actually being stolen from a VPN on a mobile device, then that's of concern for cloned phones, tablets. Soft tokens as part of a multi-factor authentication system with machine learning, some good geofencing, that can help. Because anomalies will get tagged and flagged. So access, either through a CASB or a PAM type system, could knock off the bad behavior if it's caught, but only if it's caught. And I guess the concern is that sometimes that valuable information doesn't get caught because folks aren't deploying good practices with multi-factor biometrics, geofencing, and whatnot to actually control that as a possible point of jeopardy.
Yep, I couldn't agree. Awesome. I couldn't agree more with those strategies, and I think there's a different conversation whether you're talking about mobile device malfeasance, whether it applies to the consumer or the business. Right, on the business side, you have to understand what your mobile device or bring your own device strategy is going to be, and how much risk you're willing to accept as a business. Because the fact of the matter is that malware and mobile devices being used to extract data, I think we're just really at the tip of the iceberg when it comes to that. We're seeing some of it, but we're certainly not seeing it at the level and scale that I would anticipate we will in the future. So as a business, you have to really take into account all of these factors, as well as the controls that you can put in place in order to prevent access to key data stores. And, really that comes back to a lot of things we've talked about, whether it's, data and asset inventories or just the protection of data in general. When it comes to the consumer devices, I think at some point we're going to see a large class action lawsuit that's going to force device manufacturers to really kind of step up the game and better protect these devices, because relying on the end user, the consumer, to protect their data, it's just not going to happen when it comes to leveraging the devices for the purposes that they're out there for. When you have people that don't understand technology or people that have limited exposure to technology, the device manufacturers really kind of own the protection strategies here. Unfortunately, we can't ever expect the consumers to do that.
Yeah, I have to agree with that, especially on both fronts, really. But this is unlike the other threats we've discussed today. This one really does have an area of control that is heavily dominated by both the manufacturers and, in many cases, the carriers that are responsible for deploying the devices, because in many cases they do have a lot of say over what software gets pushed on these phones. And of course, the underlying network and architecture, the technology underneath it. Again, the embedded stacks running on all of those baseband processors and so on and so forth. So yeah, I think that both from a consumer and from a business perspective, the pressure and the spotlight needs to be on these entities, because you can't. We can't say, okay, just install endpoint protection. That's not a thing that's feasible. Even the best technologies that we have from managing in a business situation, which are MDM technologies and stuff like that, those are still relying on capabilities designed by the manufacturers. So in some ways we're all kind of waiting on them to help us solve this problem.
Keeps coming back to security testing, doesn't it?
Oh yeah. Indeed.
Guys, I'm sorry, I was on mute. That wasn't me barking, though. But you're right. We can't. The thing to me about mobile malware, more than the other three things we've spoken about, is the consumer nature of the threat versus the enterprise nature of the threat. But the C level leads to the B level, and I think we need to keep that in mind whenever we talk about solutions and stuff here. But guys, here's the situation. We're a minute away or so from the top of the hour. I need to wrap things up. I think what I've done is I've incorporated a lot of people's questions into this. Just one other one, though. Can we discuss dark caracol and mobile as a delivery vector? Anyone know anything about that we could answer Vincent's questions really quickly? And if not, it's okay. No? Vincent,
Probably
I'm
not
sorry.
in the 2 minutes that we have left here.
I agree. Vincent, I'm sorry we didn't get to it earlier, but it was for people in a lively discussion. First of all, let me thank CA Vericode, One Login, Rapid7, last but not least, White Hat Security for sponsoring today's webinar. And we invite you to attend other Security Boulevard DevOps webinars in the future. Thank you very much for our all-star panel here. You guys were all rock stars. and we appreciate it. And with that being said, this is Alan Schimmel. We're going to call it a wrap, and hope everyone had a great time at the webinar. We'll see you soon at another Security Boulevard webinar. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks for having us, Alan.
All right.
Yep, thanks a lot.